Okay, so the recording is officially started. So welcome everybody to the Maui Wildfire Relief webinar. We're going to be presenting on a trauma-informed mental health kit that was designed to support people with intellectual and developmental disorders in Maui. So before we get started, I'm going to share the agenda for today's webinar. We are going to start by introducing ourselves and our projects and our organizations a little bit so you can understand the context. We'll then move to conceptualizing trauma and what trauma really means when we're thinking about trauma-informed care and this toolkit. We'll talk a little bit about the evidence-based practices for traumatic stress that inform the development of this toolkit. Then we'll introduce the toolkit itself and then go into a Q&A. So just a little introduction. This is a combined partnership by the UH Manoa Center on Disability Studies, or CDS, as well as the Department of Health Developmental Disabilities Division, or DOH-DDD. My name is Maya Mates, and I'm the person who developed this toolkit, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And our presenters today include myself, Dr. Ryan Lee, Christopher Tevez, and Grant Tanaka. So we'll all be introducing ourselves. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Chris.
Thank you, Maya. So my name is Christopher Tevis. I am a master's in social work student doing my practicum here at the Center on Disability Studies. Right now, I am wearing the blue CDS polo shirt with my background the same. The Center on Disability Studies is a research unit at the University of Hawaii. We are also designated as a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Studies, or UCED. Activities include research, program evaluation, technical assistance to community partners, training programs, community-based demonstrations, as well as dissemination. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Grant.
Hi, everybody. My name is Grant Tanaka, and I'm also a Master's Social Work practicum student working under Dr. Maya. And I am wearing a beige polo shirt that has turtles on them. And then my background is also the same. And so I'm going to talk about the Department of Health Developmental Disabilities Division. So it is an operating agency for the Medicaid 1915C, Home and Community-Based Service. The HCBS also allows states to develop home and community-based needs to people who prefer to get long-term care and supports in their home and community rather than an institutional setting. And it also oversees a statewide system of supports and services for eligible participants. And so I'm going to pass it back over to them.
Thank you, Chris and Grant. So just a little bit of introduction to the people who are working on this project. I introduced myself before. My name is Dr. Maya Mates. I am a middle-aged Asian woman. I have long dark hair. I have the CDS background behind me, and I'm wearing a dress that has some jungle designs on it with some animals. And I'll also introduce my colleague who's here with me, Dr. Ryan Lee.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ryan Lee, and I am a pediatric neurologist. I have special interests in neurodevelopmental disorders, and I'm the medical director for the Department of Health Developmental Disabilities Division. I am wearing a blue shirt from Costco, and I have just a blurred background of my home office setting. And when we first heard about the fires a little over 2.5 months ago on Maui, we wondered how we could help. Aside from the triage and contact we had with our case managers on the ground there, we began to think of ways that we could integrate mental health supports. And so we reached out to our colleagues at the university, and we're so happy that we got introduced to Dr. Maya, who brought her students on board, and I've just had a great time working with them since then on providing supports for people on Maui who are participants who have been displaced or lost their homes. So it's just been a wonderful friendship and collaboration that we've had with them, and I'm thankful for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. We are very appreciative of this partnership as well. We really feel like it's made an impact so far, and we hope through this webinar that the tools that we've developed will continue to make an impact in the community. So just a little background, I'm sure everyone here is familiar, but a little bit about the Maui wildfire in numbers. I'm going to pass it back over to my colleague, Chris.
Thank you. So as we know, the Maui wildfire was a tragic event that took place, and more than 2,000 homes were destroyed, along with 115 lives of those who, or 115 of those who lost their lives. More than 800 businesses were lost, and 7,000 employees were displaced as well. I'm going to hand it over to Grant now to talk a little bit more.
Thanks, Chris. So before we get started into our workbook and toolkit, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are thinking about trauma. So just a little bit of background. So we have this built-in alarm system in our bodies that signals to us when we might be in danger. So when we experience a traumatic event, this internal alarm system is activated. And one of the reasons why human beings have been so successful in surviving over time is because of this alarm system. Our brain recognizes danger and activates this system. And this system, which is known as the stress response pathway, or the HPA axis for the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland axis, this is a system that is hardwired into our nervous system. So it happens automatically whenever that alarm system is activated. And that alarm system is something that comes with a lot of benefits as well as disadvantages. So when our brain recognizes danger, this alarm system signals this automatic response that prepares our body to deal with the danger and survive. So we have 4 major responses that are engaged by your nervous system. Fight, we can fight back, we can run away or flight, we can freeze, or we can fawn. So all of these responses take a lot of energy and focus. So our stress response system triggers the release of various chemicals throughout the body to give us fuel that allows us to be energized and to survive with rather limited resources during this time. However, our bodies can remain in these heightened anxious states for a long time after the initial danger or the initial traumatic event has passed. The stress response in our body then turns into traumatic stress, which can affect our physical and mental health. So some of the characteristics associated with each of these responses are displayed in this diagram on the screen. So for the fight response, we see people who experience rage, anger, a lot of outbursts. And you can see how that might be connected to that very primal nervous system response. For those in that flight mode, they might experience panic, worry, or rumination, really thinking about what had happened and trying to avoid things that remind them of it. In the freeze response, we see reactions like numbness and dissociation, very common responses to a traumatic event and associated with this freeze response. And then in the fawn response, which I think is the lesser known, we see a lot of confusion as well as codependency on the people around us, which does make sense from a survival perspective. We want to be relying on the people around us in times of trouble. However, once that initial danger has passed, that level of codependency can become maladaptive and not as helpful as in those initial phases of reacting to the traumatic event. So all of these responses have a huge effect on both our physical body, multiple systems are affected, as well as our mental health, which I'll talk about next. So the psychological effects of trauma really disrupt an entire system within the body related to emotional regulation. So day-to-day functions are really disrupted. People often experience depression, anxiety, anger, intense fear, flashbacks, and paranoia. And this is often most acute in the period following the traumatic event. And it's very normal for anyone experiencing a trauma, especially of the magnitude of the Maui wildfires, that people experience heightened emotional distress in the aftermath of such a disaster. However, we also know that this traumatic experience goes beyond the initial response and can lead into this sort of post-traumatic experience period. And this doesn't necessarily have to be PTSD, which is probably the most common mental health diagnosis known in response to traumatic stress. But a lot of people go on to develop anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, depression, various types of reactions due to the prolonged traumatic stress that they experience. So people can develop this belief that the world around them is unsafe and that people are dangerous because of this heightened traumatic stress reaction. And it also can lead to PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. And so in this time period where we are right now, we are in a prime position to, one, help people who are experiencing traumatic stress in relation to the Maui wildfire disaster, as well as two, help prevent the development of PTSD in those who are affected. I'm going to turn it over to my student Grant, who's going to talk a little bit about trauma in the population that we're concerned with here, which is people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Yeah. So, like Dr. Maya was saying, we talked about the trauma and people with IDD. So people with IDD are more likely to experience complex trauma throughout their lives. They also experience the same mental health conditions as anyone else, including PTSD. And most interventions for this population focus on behavior instead of emotions or coping. Within this demographic, there is a lack of mental health providers who feel confident working with this population, as well as there being limited research on trauma. And, due to the limited research on the trauma within this particular population. And so I'm going to pass it back over to Dr. Maya.
Thank you, Grant. So now we'll talk a little bit about some evidence-based practices for traumatic stress that have informed the toolkit that we developed. So I have on the screen a list of evidence-based interventions that were designed to prevent the onset of PTSD, as well as to treat PTSD once it's fully developed. And these are evidence-based practices that range from short-term to long-term, but they all have a very strong evidence base in research. So critical incident stress debriefing, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, cognitive processing therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, cognitive restructuring therapy, and stress inoculation therapy. So all different therapies with different sort of approaches, conceptualizations of traumatic stress, and how the interventions work. I do want to highlight amongst these that only one is for children or adolescents, and that's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT. And none of these have been shown or even researched in relation to individuals with developmental disabilities. There's a little bit coming out in relation to adapting TFCBT, but there isn't any evidence that we can call it an evidence-based practice for this population. So the reason why I'm bringing up all of these different interventions is because we have a good idea of how to treat PTSD in the neurotypical population, especially in adults. So we understand how it works. The military in particular has directed a lot of funding towards PTSD research in regards to its veteran population. And that in turn has really informed our understanding in the field of psychology. Across all of these evidence-based practices, as different as they might be theoretically and in an approach, there are some key features that show up across the board. And these features include education about reactions to trauma, so normalizing the experiences that people have, exposure to the trauma through storytelling to others. So exposure here, we mean that we are talking about the traumatic experience instead of avoiding thinking about it and avoiding talking about it. So exposure is one of the most well-supported interventions for any type of anxiety. And we see here that it's very helpful for post-traumatic stress disorder and the anxiety that people experience within that. So storytelling, talking about your experience is a feature across the board in these evidence-based practices. Another really key feature is the belief that you can cope and heal. And interestingly, this is one of the key features, not having the coping skills, but necessarily, but having the belief that you will cope and that you will heal eventually in the future is a really key ingredient towards these evidence-based practices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the toolkit we developed. In thinking about how we could really support this population in Maui, we thought about a few different approaches. And one thing that I kept getting stuck on was that there are a lot of providers out there, a lot of service providers working in response to this event, doing a lot of crisis support, a lot of mental health support. There are so many organizations providing supports, and we didn't really want to be redundant. And especially because we can only serve a limited amount of people in our capacity, we really wanted to create something that we could disseminate to the community to use to support individuals with developmental disorders, because we know children and adults with developmental disorders are receiving services across the board through a wide range of community organizations. So we've put together a few things. The first is a social story workbook, and we have both an adult or teen version of this, as well as a keiki version. These are very similar. The main difference is that the keiki version includes imagery in which children are represented instead of adults. They both have a lot of visual aids and use plain language. We also have a reference card that we've developed for providers or families working to support individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are experiencing traumatic stress. So these are tips that we have pulled from psychological first aid. So we'll talk about that reference card first. So here you can see the front and back of this reference card. It was designed to be something that people could have readily available, that they could take a quick look at. We know that a lot of mental health response in Maui has centered on psychological first aid. However, many people feel uncomfortable working with individuals with IDD or are unsure about how to adapt some of those approaches to this population. So here we have just really basic principles such as listen, protect, connect, model, and teach, along with some sample language that people can use when working with individuals with IDD to help support them when they're showing signs of emotional distress related to a traumatic event. And then we also have some self-care tips on the back, just because we know people working in response to this traumatic event are experiencing a lot of secondhand trauma themselves. Some of them experience loss themselves in the Maui wildfires. And it's really difficult and draining work. And so we always want to make sure that we're promoting self-care amongst any helpers. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about our workbook. So I mentioned that it is a social story workbook, and some of you may be familiar with this concept, and it may be brand new for others. So just for those of you who are learning about social stories for the first time, social stories are an evidence-based practice that was initially developed to assist individuals with IDD with social situations and expectations. It's used a lot in the educational environment for students, especially those with autism, and it's also used very frequently in intervention settings, medical facilities, and so on to help people understand situations and expectations. So social stories are very simple. They break down what is going to happen in a situation, and they answer a lot of these WH questions: where, when, who, what, and why. So answering all of these in plain language, often with the help of visual aids, and then also being very direct and frank about the negative aspects of a situation that someone might experience. However, these social stories do use an overly and generally positive tone, tend to emphasize the appropriate way that someone can respond or coping skills that they can use when things get difficult, and end on a hopeful note. So I'm just going to show a very quick example of a traditional social story. So this is a simple social story that was used to teach children what it means to be a kind friend. So in this first image, we have two children. There's a bubble that says hi, and underneath it says, being a good friend means using kind words and kind voice. So it's very descriptive about the behavior that's expected in this situation. This next picture has two children again with some toys, and the text reads, I share the toys at school and I ask to use a toy before taking it from a friend. So again, guiding someone through the process about thinking about what they can do in this situation to be a good friend. This is a very short snippet of a social story. I just wanted to give you some context for how this is often used. I think the main principles that I want you to take away from this are the visuals, as well as the plain language and the directness with which the social stories emphasize expectations. So we have a social story in our workbook, and it describes the wildfire in Maui. So the conceptualization of this is to really explain what transpired and give information to individuals with IDD. We tend to want to protect individuals with IDD. Maybe we think that they will be really upset, or maybe we fear that they won't completely understand what has transpired. Same thing with children. We tend not to give them the full story. However, children and people with IDD in general are very intuitive. They are hearing things, they are seeing things, they are picking up on the anxiety and distress of the people around them. And sometimes having gaps in the information is really difficult and can be more anxiety provoking for individuals than having a complete picture of what happened. So this social story is designed to give context to the Maui wildfires. Our first page gives a context of what a wildfire is. It's a fire that started in the trees and grass. We emphasize things that people may have seen either in photos or in their personal experience: smoke, fire, burning buildings, people running away. The next page, we have some of the more difficult things that happened in relation to the wildfires. We talk about how people had to flee into the water to escape to be safe. We acknowledge that many people and animals were hurt and that some died. And we say this very directly and very frankly. We also talk about how many people who lost their homes had to stay in shelters or hotels following the events of the wildfire. We then move into emotional reactions that people might be having in response to the traumatic event: feeling scared, feeling mad, worried, feeling very sad. And these are providing that education about response to traumatic events that people might be experiencing, normalizing those experiences, and explaining why someone or the people around them might be experiencing these heightened emotions. The next page ends on a positive note. So we emphasize all of the helpers in Maui who are contributing to helping our Maui ohana. We emphasize that we will be rebuilding and that Maui is strong. So even though we're very direct in speaking about some of the difficulties that people have been experiencing, we end on that positive note. So when using the social story, we really are just encouraging people to go through the social story with people in their care. Just talk story, talk about what happened. If it leads to a conversation, great. If people have questions, great. Answer them to the best of your ability. It really just creates an opportunity for us to be talking about what happened. And because we know that talking about these traumatic events helps heal PTSD symptoms, we encourage you to come back to look at this social story multiple times. Have it available to people to look at on their own if they're thinking about it and want to return to the social story for their own information, and return to it together to reprocess and talk about it again. The more that we talk about it, the better is the takeaway. You can always take breaks as needed if someone starts to become distressed, but I do recommend that the social story is delivered in its completion, just so we are ending on that positive note with the rebuilding and Maui being strong. So here we just have a quick picture of one of our DDD participants going through the social story. I'm going to go into some of our workbook activities next. So the first workbook activity we have focuses on emotions and feelings. So we prompt individuals to think about what they're feeling in relation to the wildfire, while also normalizing that everyone has big feelings about the wildfire. So here again, we're normalizing traumatic stress responses, but we're also providing visuals and words to people who may struggle with self-expression or identifying emotions. So we have a range of emotions that people can indicate either verbally or by pointing to a picture. We also have some blank areas where people can fill in different emotions or smileys, and then an area where people can draw a picture of how they feel. This could be abstract, it can be very literal. Some people draw emojis, some people write a little bit here, some people draw very elaborate descriptive illustrations, but it just allows for that creativity and time and space to process what people are feeling. Next, we have an activity that focuses on physical sensations, and we title this My Body. And here we're normalizing the physical reactions to traumatic stress that people might be experiencing. So we have, again, visuals and words that people can use to indicate what they are feeling. And I think it's important that this is available to people regularly. So if they are feeling something, they can also return to use this as a communication tool to express their physical sensations as well. We also have another drawing opportunity where people can draw how their body feels, or write or label or do whatever they would like to do in a creative way to think about what their body is feeling. The next activity focuses on coping skills. So we call this healing. And here we have some strategies that people can use to make themselves feel better when they're feeling a high level of emotional distress. So really basic coping skills that don't need a lot of teaching. Things like drinking cold water, listening to music, squeezing, what do you call them? A little stress ball. I have one on my desk here. Giving hugs, doing art, being creative, only or chanting, taking deep breaths, being with your ohana, and finally counting. Some of these strategies are based in grounding principles, things to bring you back to your body, like the cold water, squeezing, hugs, deep breaths, counting. Others are just helpful for processing, like music, art, and being with your family, as well as relaxation. And then we have a few blank spaces for people to think about other things that make them feel good that they can indicate. And this acts as a menu, so people can come back to this activity and think about what they can do to help themselves feel better when they're upset. And then we have a couple of pictures here of some of our DDD participants doing these activities. The final component of our workbook is a trauma narrative. And so we call this My Wildfire Story. And this is an opportunity for an individual to talk about their personal experience in relation to the Maui wildfires. And we've done this with individuals who had very direct impact, people who lost their homes, who fled for their lives, as well as individuals who saw images on TV, saw smoke, or know people such as family, friends, or relatives who were impacted and have heard a little bit about what they were going through. And we found that this has been helpful for everybody. So regardless of the degree of impact, we're thinking about traumatic stress in relation to this event very broadly for anyone who is affected or seen images related to this. And so again, this is going off the principle that the more we talk about our experiences, the more our brains and bodies are able to process, recognize that this trauma has passed and is no longer a threat to us in the moment, and allow us to move past some of those traumatic stress responses in the body. So we ask people to talk about where they were when the fire started. We have room for writing as well as drawing. We then ask people to think about their sensory experiences, things that they could see, hear, smell, and touch. And again, space for writing and drawing. Then we ask people to talk about the scariest thing that happened to them. And I like to talk about this as sort of the sticky thing, right? This is the thing that really sticks with us. And the scariest thing that happened to people is sometimes surprising. It may not be what you expect, but it gives people an opportunity to really reflect on the thing that is causing them the most distress, give them an opportunity to process it and communicate that to other people in a safe way. We then ask people to comment on what's happening now, hopefully bringing awareness to the fact that people are feeling more safe now and that things are moving forward. And then we end on a happy note with an exercise in gratitude, asking people what they're thankful for. So all of this comprises the trauma narrative component of this workbook. And this is an activity that can take a long time to complete and might be very emotionally distressing for people when doing it. So we have some tips to facilitate that, that I'll go through but I think in the meantime, I'm going to introduce Dr. Lee again, and he's going to talk us through some of these images that we have of our participants in Maui doing this workbook. We did them in groups and we also did them individually. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Lee.
Okay, thanks, Maya. So what you see, well, we can move on to the next one if there's another one. I think we saw this picture already. There we go. So in response to the fires, we not only provided visits to individuals, but we also felt that we needed to visit some of the day programs there. So DDD has agencies that support programs that help our people. And a few of these are Easter Seals, the Ark of Maui, and Kalima o Maui. And what you're looking at here is a day program called Kalima o Maui. And it had about 20 individuals with intellectual and developmental disability, 15 to 20, along with about 5 staff workers. And we worked on 3 tables. We brought in the tool, and this picture shows this is towards the end of our visit, when we gave them an opportunity to share in front of the group some of their work or their pages. And I think it gave them great pride to stand up in front of their peers and read a page or discuss what their thoughts. This lady on the right here talked about helping people that were homeless and just how she wanted to help other people get food. And so this picture right here is the Easter Seals. So again, we had a similar number of individuals. It was maybe 15 to 20 people with IDD in a larger activity room with tables in a U shape. And it was facilitated by Dr. Maya, who kind of instructed the larger group in this sense. And then we had staff members and Grant and Chris working independently with our people here. And, what we saw was that people were very engaged. They were engaged with the workbook. And also the staff members had an opportunity to interact with the participants. What we find is that if you give them the opportunity to share about the experience, they're more than willing to talk about it, either independently or in a larger group setting. The workbook provides somewhat of a roadmap or a guideposts for that discussion. And so it's actually a simple setup. Where the hosting site just needs to have some writing utensils like crayons or pens and pencils and a table, some seats, and everything else as far as the workbooks were brought by the UH. And this is again Kalima and the work settings. So what I felt, there's and this lady here who's in the Polaroid shirt giving the shaka is Jennifer, and she had lost her home in the fire. What we saw with the group is that they knew that she lost her home. They're afraid for her in the first couple of weeks because they couldn't find her. They could not contact her. And this is not an uncommon story. We had this in other participants where they couldn't find them or contact them. And so they were afraid for their well-being. Turns out she'd turned out okay, but they knew that she lost her home. And many were concerned and lived their emotional experiences through her, actually. But she turned out to be okay, and she enjoys going to day program Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here with her colleagues. The gentleman on your bottom left here talking with Maya, he did not lose his home or get displaced by the fire, but as we were discussing the fires, it opened up an area of his life in his past where he had experienced fire and other forms of trauma and abuse. And so that can happen, and so he discussed how the fire reminded him of this other fire that happened in his life, and it had to do with another death of a family members. And so he ended up talking about it, and it's quite emotional too. So it may not be direct impact from the fire, but this can also bring about other forms of trauma that need healing. And this is him not sharing that story, but just wanting to share in front of everybody about the fires there. And lastly, we have individual meetings with families. This is Violetta and her son Leo, whom we met at Napili, which is in the northern west coast of Maui. They managed to escape the fire and survive in their car. They told just a very emotional story to all of us in their living room here, where they're staying at the hotel in Napili, about that escape and survival. And now they're undergoing some of the typical things that families are dealing with now, which is, they're living out of suitcases or boxes in this hotel. They're not sure how long they can stay. They're staying until at least the 31st in this place, and then they might have to be displaced again. They're trying to find a home after that, manage school for Leo here, who has to travel to Kihei to go to school at Horizons, and also deal with a lot of the emotions that came with being a survivor in the fire, but also in their minds reliving the flashbacks and struggles of not being able to save other people that they saw on the way out, and just the emotional smells and feelings of it all. And so they were brave enough to share with us their experience. And after this, we talked quite intensely about some of those feelings, and Maya was able to provide them some counseling and therapy. But it's an ongoing process for people like Violetta and Leo, who are struggling, and we're continuing to try to meet their needs for shelter, for feelings of safety, and then also for healing in their minds and bodies.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. So I think it's really helpful to hear about the context in which we have used the workbooks for you to thinking about when you might use them as well. So, I went through the activities and the key features again: education about reactions to trauma, exposure to the trauma through storytelling to others, and the belief that you can cope and heal being the most important elements. So when you are using this workbook, we really encourage you to take your time, find the space, find the timing that works well for you. We typically spend almost an hour, sometimes more, with groups working on the workbook, but it does not have to be done in one setting. You can break up the social story and the workbook components, as well as the trauma narrative. We also recommend that people return to that social story frequently. That's something that you can reread. And each time, the discussion might be very different. The first time there might be questions. It might be just focused on identifying some of the pictures that come up, or that things that they see in the social story itself. But we're really hoping it will facilitate talk story for individuals for whom communication can be challenged, and for families and providers who may not know how to approach this topic with this population. We also want to mention that it's really important to just validate all of the feelings that come up, right? When we're thinking about just normalizing that traumatic response and letting people know that whatever they're feeling and experiencing is okay, and it makes sense because they went through something really difficult. Give opportunity for questions. I think I said that before, but we had some really great questions from our participants around the fire, around where people were staying, around what happened to people that they knew, and just a lot of interjection about personal experiences as well. So when we were reading the social story and when it talks about smoke, people were saying, yeah, I saw smoke. I saw smoke in the mountains. I smelled smoke. There was ashes on my mom's arms, all of these sort of things that were coming up for people. And being able to share that with each other and with us, I think was really spectacular in terms of facilitating that storytelling and that group healing. However, it doesn't need to be done in a group. This can be done one-on-one with someone. I think this is a great tool to use within families to promote discussion about what happened to the families and your unique experiences. But sharing, I think, is key, right? It's not just simply reading the social story and doing the activities. It's also about sharing what happened to you and your experiences. So I was very honest with people when doing the workbook. When we talked about the trauma narrative part, I said, I saw images on TV, on the news, because I wasn't in Maui. I was here in Oahu at the time. But a lot of other people that we worked with also saw things on the news, some very disturbing images or disturbing images on social media. And it opened up the door for that type of conversation as well. So I encourage you when doing this workbook to participate in it as well. Label your own feelings and tell your own story. So we are, I think, nearing the end. I just want to show that we do have this toolkit available for free download up on our website. And then our students are also going to drop that link in the chat for you to grab, or you can use this QR code. Free downloads of the provider cards, the workbooks. We are developing a short video that will show how to use the workbooks that will be posted soon. The webinar will be recorded and posted up on this website as well. And if you would like hard copies of either the workbooks or provider cards, you can reach out to me and I'll put my email up in just a second. But first, thank you to our Adult Day Health programs that we've been working with, Easter Seals of Maui, Arc of Maui, Kalima o Maui. They gave us permission to use these photos and tell their stories, which is really generous of them. And here is our contact information. And so you have my email address here, as well as my phone number. If you would like to request hard copies of the toolkit, we're happy to mail those out to you or arrange a drop off or pickup, however we can. Please reach out if you would like those. What I'm going to do now is turn it over for questions. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to turn on your video, unmute yourself, or put something in the chat. Anybody have questions?
I just want to say thank you. I don't have questions, but thank you guys so much.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear that you appreciated it. Thanks for coming. Okay, well, I want to be conscientious of everyone's time. We do have a webinar evaluation form that I would like everyone to encourage to take, just a few questions, really short. It really helps us when we report back to our funding agencies. Please take that evaluation. The survey is in the chat. There's a link to it, and that is really helpful for us. We'll stick around for a few more minutes in case anybody has any questions or would like to chat further, but I'm going to now turn off the recording for this webinar.